I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Marta Reina-Campos, a CETA National Fellow at McMaster University. Marta obtained her PhD in 2020 from Heidelberg University. And before that, she obtained her bachelor's and master's from the University of Barcelona. Marta is interested in how stellar clusters form and evolve in a hierarchical galaxy assembly context, with her ultimate goal being to be able to use old massive stellar cluster populations as near-field cosmological tracers. So now I'll pass the floor to Marta, who's going to tell us more about modeling stellar cluster populations alongside their host galaxies in a cosmic environment. So yeah, take it away.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Carolina, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. I'm Marta, and as Carolina said, if you have any question, please feel free to interrupt. So I like stellar clusters, as Carolina said, and over the past few years, I've been interested in trying to understand how we can study how these objects form and evolve from a theoretical perspective, also taking into account the fact that these objects don't form in isolation, but that they form in galaxies and how they're evolving over Hubble time of evolution. So in order to do this sort of a study, I've been using numerical simulations of galaxy formation, like the one that is playing in the background of this slide, where you can see the formation and assembly of a Milky Way mass galaxy. Now, starting from the beginning again, where the gray color bar corresponds to the gas density and all the color dots that have been running around correspond to the stellar cluster populations that are forming and being assembled over cosmic time. So for the first part of my talk, I've tried to divide this talk into sort of two parts. In the first one, I want to talk about why stellar clusters are so interesting and different strategies that we can follow when we want to model their formation and evolution in a cosmological environment. And in the second part of my talk, I want to show you some very recent results about how we can, using these simulated stellar cluster populations and their host galaxies, we can see that there are links between globular cluster populations and their host environments, and that we find these links only using the spatial information. And I will discuss what we can learn from these results. So let me just start from the beginning and discuss what are globular clusters. And for this, I like to go back to one of the first catalogs of stellar clusters and planetary nebulae, which were done by Sir William Herschel and his sister. And in these catalogs, they wrote that first of all, it will be necessary to explain what is our idea of a cluster of stars, and by what means we have obtained it. For an instance, I shall take the phenomenon which presents itself in many clusters. It is that of a number of lucid spots of equal luster scattered over a circular space in such a manner as to appear gradually more compressed towards the middle, and which compression, in the clusters to which I allude, is generally carried so far as, by imperceptible degrees, to end in a luminous center of a resolvable blaze of light. We now know that the objects that they were observing corresponds to gravitationally bound stellar systems that contain millions of stars that are extremely massive, that have roughly spherical shapes, and of which you can see two examples at the bottom of this slide. We also know that these objects are relatively metal poor and that they have ages that are comparable with the age of the universe. So they are quite peculiar objects. We can place these objects in the context of our own galaxy. And for this, I'll be using this beautiful stellar density map from the early data release 3 of Gaia, where each pixel is showing the number of stars by the area that the pixel is covering. So brighter pixels correspond to a higher number of stars. And you can see in this image, we can very clearly see the galactic disk traced by all the bright, this bright horizontal feature in the middle. And we can also see very clearly the small and the large Magellanic Clouds. And if you have a bright enough display, you will see that there's some very bright spots sort of scattered around the galaxy. And if we identify these spots, we can see that the majority of them correspond to the gravitationally bound stellar systems that are very massive, relatively metal poor, and relatively old, that we generally refer to as globular clusters. And these seem to be sort of laying around in our galaxy sort of everywhere. If we look at our galaxy in more detail, we will see that there are gravitationally bound stellar systems that are not as extreme as these ones. And in fact, we find that the stellar cluster population in the Milky Way and its satellites has quite a variety in terms of properties. This is also a really nice image from a review by Mark Krumholz and collaborators, where they show 7 or 8 different type of stellar clusters, and these are ordered based on their age. So from left to right and from top to bottom, we're going from the Orion Nebulae cluster, which is currently forming, to 47 Tau, which is older than 10 gigayears and with an age comparable with the age of the universe. What's also quite striking from this stellar cluster population is that the objects shown in this image span a wide range in terms of their masses. So with some objects that only have 100 solar masses and some others that have of the order of 10 to the 6 solar masses. And they also present a wide range of variety in terms of their metallicities and their chemical abundances, as well as where they're sitting within the galaxy. So this wide range of properties has led to the suggestion that maybe we can understand stellar clusters and stellar cluster populations as just being part of a continuum whose physical properties are determined by where these clusters form and how these clusters evolve since their formation until we observe them. And in this scenario, the massive, relatively metal poor end of the distribution would correspond to the objects that we call globular clusters that were first observed by Sir William Herschel and his sister. What this scenario would also be telling us is that if the right gas conditions were met in our local universe, we would expect to see massive cluster formation happening nowadays. And this was indeed seen for the first time sort of 2 to 3 decades ago from ground-based observed telescopes, but also a lot of work has been done with the Hubble Space Telescope. And so when we have looked at high pressure star-bursting dwarf galaxies, we have seen that there are some globular cluster-like objects that are forming at present time. And in this beautiful image of the Antennae galaxy, you can see that there's like a bunch of very bright, very intensely blue sort of spots scattered around in the galaxy. These are these superstellar clusters, or as were known at the beginning, or as we know them today, we generally just refer to them as young massive clusters. What's quite interesting of these objects is that we can compare their properties with the properties that we see that globular clusters have. And I'm showing in this slide 3 different examples of young massive clusters on the bottom and the top part of the slide, and 3 examples of globular clusters in the bottom part of this slide. What's quite interesting is that when we compare the properties of these 2 objects in terms of their masses and their sizes, they have fairly similar values. They also both trace the stellar environment of their galaxies, and what they mostly differ in is in the fact that young massive clusters are still deeply embedded or mostly deeply embedded in their natal environment. So they're embedded in gas environments that tend to be very dense, or they're disrupting that environment. Whereas globular clusters tend to be in environments that are devoid of gas, such as the outskirts of galaxies. And the only other difference that we're sort of finding so far is the fact that young massive clusters are young, whereas globulars seem to be much older, with ages of a few gigayears up to more than 10 gigayears. But this similarity of properties has led to the idea within the field that maybe we can understand globular clusters as just being the products of regular cluster formation that formed at high redshift, and these are the ones that have managed to survive until present day. And all the other type of clusters just didn't manage to survive. They just got disrupted over time. So what our scenario is at the moment is that once upon a time, when the universe was young, galaxies were gas-rich, and the gas within the galaxies was collapsing and forming extremely massive gravitationally bound stellar systems. And so the stellar feedback from the massive stars from these stellar clusters, together with the dynamical processes, such as the ones due to the high merger rates that we expect to happen at high redshift, would help the migration of stellar clusters from their natal environment out to the galactic disk or even toward the galactic outskirts. And this migration would be critical to ensure the survivability of these stellar clusters over a Hubble time. But if we want to be accurately modeling how stellar clusters are forming and evolving over 14 gigayears of evolution, we have to take into account that these galaxies were not the same at redshift 4 to what they are nowadays. And so we need to take into account that galaxies are embedded in the cosmic web of large scale structure and that they have formed from the collapse of the largest scale matter perturbations. And so in order to model stellar clusters properly, we need to be able to also model how their host galactic environment has formed and has assembled and has changed over cosmic time. And so we need numerical simulations that allows us to go from the largest scale structure and the cosmic web down to the star bursting environments in which we see massive cluster formation happening today in the local universe, as well as the more quiescent environments in which we see that there are these surviving globular cluster populations. And so this leads me to the first part of my talk, where I wanted to discuss some different strategies that we can follow from a theoretical perspective in order to be able to model this formation and evolution of star clusters and their environment. And the way I see it, there are different strategies. It just depends a bit on the question that you're trying to address. So if we start focusing on the small scales, we can say, well, let's forget about the cosmic environment. Let's forget about the galaxy. That's too difficult. Let's just start focusing on the small scales. How do individual star clusters form from collapsing clouds? So how does a cloud of gas collapse? How does lead to star formation? Which feedback mechanisms are the relevant ones in order to disrupt the cloud of gas? And what do we get out of this collapse? In order to model and try to address all of these questions, we typically require what we call a cloud in a box type of simulations, where within a box we place a cloud of gas. And so we need to evolve this simulation with a code that is capable of resolving the equations of hydrodynamics as well as gravity, and that it has a good prescription for how star formation and stellar feedback proceeds. But once the feedback from the massive stars in stellar clusters have been able to disrupt the cloud of gas, we might ask ourselves, well, now we want to address the question of how do individual star clusters evolve in a galactic potential. And in order to address this question, we now need to change slightly the type of simulations that we use, because we no longer have to include the gas description in our simulations, but instead we require a really precise gravitational solver that is capable of accurately modeling the gravitational interactions between the stars in the stellar cluster. And so in this type of individual cluster simulations, as I call them, we can both study their formation from collapsing clouds as well as their evolution. These simulations typically have what we call high resolution, because one particle in this simulation corresponds to actually what we would call one star in the real universe. But because the physical processes that we're trying to study have very different timescale, the collapsing cloud simulations are normally run only for a few mega years, because that's the timescale over which the gas cloud is blown apart. Whereas if we want to study the evolution of these clusters, we need to evolve them for about 10 giga years. Despite the high resolution, we can run a large number of each of these simulations. And of course, the caveat that they have is that none of these contain information about the galactic or the cosmic environment. There's a lot of different groups that are doing a really great job trying to address these two questions. And here I'm just showing a few examples. On the left, I'm showing a couple of recent papers where they are actually doing these sort of cloud in a box type of simulations, let the cloud collapse and see what type of stellar clusters they're getting. And you can see how the stellar feedback from the stars are blowing away the cloud of gas. On the right, I'm showing the first direct embodied simulations of globular clusters that was run with 1 million particles. And this was a great achievement in the field of trying to do gravitational evolution of stellar clusters. So what can we learn from these type of simulations? Well, because we have such high resolution, we can try and look at intrinsic cluster properties. We can also look at their detailed chemical abundances, and we can place constraints and try to understand why we see that some stellar clusters, or the vast majority of the old stellar clusters, seem to have chemically distinct stellar populations. We can also look at what's the role of a specific feedback mechanisms in cluster formation. We can look at what are the formation and evolution of binary systems in clusters. And we can look at even what the formation and evolution of exotic stellar species, such as black holes, neutron stars, and white dwarfs in these dense stellar environments. And of course, each of these topics can be compared with either current or upcoming observational data and facilities. If we go one step up in our ladder of scales, the next question that we might try to address is actually, well, maybe doing a simulation of one cloud in a box is a bit too small and the cosmic environment is a bit too much. So how can we model star clusters, how they form and how they're evolving within their galactic environment? These sort of simulations are extremely challenging because they're modeling an entire galaxy at the same time that they're trying to reach a resolution such that each star in their simulation is actually a star, or what we would call a star in real life, or a low mass stellar population. This extremely high mass and spatial resolution places very strong constraints over how long they can run these simulations for. So these are typically run for a few mega years up to a few giga years. And it also places strong constraints on how many models they can explore. But at the same time, it gives them this extremely detailed view of resolved stellar clusters and their galactic environment, although they don't include cosmic evolution. So there has been some very recent development sort of in these type of simulations recently, and these are just 3 different examples from 3 different groups. And as you can see, these are the state of the art currently in the field because they're capable of forming and evolving resolved stellar clusters within the galactic environment. Although it is very challenging to do these sort of numerical simulations. As in the one stellar cluster in a box type of simulations, from these galaxy simulations, we can also study the intrinsic cluster properties. We can also look at detailed chemical abundances and what's the formation and evolution of binary systems in clusters. And what's more interesting is that they are capable of relating this intrinsic cluster information with the galactic environment. And so they can look at what's the role of the galactic environment in modifying how stellar clusters form. And as previously, each of these different topics can be compared with either current or upcoming observational surveys and facilities. In the last step of our ladder, we might consider, well, now we have considered the details of star formation and stellar feedback. We have considered how these detailed prescriptions occur in a galactic environment. Now I want to include not only the cosmic environment, but also the cosmic evolution. So the question that we might try to address is how do star clusters form and evolve within a cosmological environment over 14 giga years of evolution? In order to address this question, we have to sacrifice something. As in the previous set of simulations, they had pushed for extremely high resolution. Here, the philosophy that has been taken so far is to go the other way around. So rather than having resolved stellar clusters by several stars, we say that one star can contain several stellar clusters. And this is what it's typically referred to as a subgrid approximation. So using these subgrid models for stellar cluster and stellar evolution, we can include stellar clusters in big scale galaxy formation and evolution simulations. Sacrificing on the resolution means that we can run our larger scale simulations for the entirety of the evolution of the universe, so almost 14 giga years. It also means that we can run a large number of models, and so we can try and study which are the particular input models that we use to describe our stellar cluster populations that better reproduce what we see at redshift 0. And in these type of descriptions, we're including both the galactic environment and the cosmic environment and evolution. But of course, they have the caveat that our clusters are not resolved. They're not even an individual particle in the simulation. They're just kind of tagging along our stars. So there's been a very influential project using this philosophy, which is the eMosaics project, out of which I've been working during my PhD. And this project has used the subgrid approximation for cluster formation and evolution, and it has implemented this within the Eagle galaxy formation model. And as you can see in the image on the left, this has allowed us to study from the large scale structure of the cosmic web down to one node, one galaxy, and the stellar cluster population within that galaxy. However, we've seen that the Eagle galaxy formation model doesn't include a description for the cold phase of the interstellar medium. And we expect that this is going to be a critical phase to accurately describe how stellar clusters form and evolve, because that's where they form and that's where we expect that most of their disruption is going to happen. So during my PhD, I've also been working on developing what we're calling the Emp Pathfinder Simulations, which are using the exact same philosophy as mosaics. They're just implemented on a different hydrodynamical solver, which is a repo, and we're using our own set of star formation and stellar feedback routines in a cosmic environment that can go down to low temperatures. What we can learn from these type of simulations of stellar clusters is, well, we can forget about the intrinsic cluster properties because our resolution is too low, but we can place constraints because we have this cosmic time of evolution. So we can make predictions on what cluster formation might look like at high redshift. We can place predictions on where do we expect to find relics from cluster disruption in phase space. We can look at what's the influence of the galactic environment on cluster demographics as a whole, and we can look at these as a function of different galaxy masses. So we can look at either galaxy clusters or low mass dwarfs, and we can try and link these stellar cluster populations with the formation and assembly history of their host galactic environment. And this leads me to the second part of my talk, where I'm going to be focusing on this aspect a bit more. And in particular, what I want to discuss is how these are just some very recent results of how we can use just the spatial information. So where are stellar clusters within their galaxy, and how we are seeing that these can be linked with where the clusters form, but also what the matter distribution around the galaxy. So what is the dark matter halo distribution in that galaxy? What does it look like? In particular, in order to address these questions, I've been making use of the results from the eMosaics project, where, as I've said, we're using this philosophy of saying that our stellar clusters are a subgrid component of the stellar particles. And so we have implemented this subgrid description onto the Eagle galaxy formation model. And this is allowing us to go all the way from the cosmic web down to one galaxy and its stellar cluster population. What we've managed to do, thanks to using this subgrid approximation, is that we've been able to bridge between scales. And so at first we focused at simulating a volume limited sample of 25 cosmological zoom-in present-day Milky Way mass galaxies. But then we decided to take a step forward and actually model an entire 34 megaparsec periodic volume at redshift 0. And just to give you an idea, within this volume, we've gone from having 25 Milky Ways to having of the order of 110 or something like that. So by using the results of this periodic volume, we can study stellar cluster populations as a function of galactic environment. So we're going from very massive galaxies down to the tiny low mass dwarfs. So using this simulated data, I first tried to address the question of whether we can try and trace the origin of globular clusters using the radial distributions and metallicities. And the reasoning behind this is that when we look in our own galaxy and we look at the population of globular clusters in our own galaxy, we see that they present a bimodal metallicity distribution, in which the metal poor objects are typically older and are more radially extended. And this is what I'm showing in the figure here. So this figure corresponds to the number density radial profile of galactic globular clusters. That's the black line. And then the blue and the red correspond to the metal poor and metal rich subpopulations respectively. And it has long been suggested that because galaxies grow via a combination of in situ star formation and accretion of satellite galaxies, the fact that we see metal poor objects preferentially being in the outskirts of galaxies must be a sign that these objects are preferentially accreted, whereas the metal-rich globular cluster populations must have come preferentially from in situ star formation. And so this is the type of question that I wanted to address. And for which I've been using the galaxies contained in the 34 megaparsec periodic volume of mosaics. So the first thing that I wanted to do was to quantify the projected radial profiles of globulars. And the reason for this is that I wanted to make sure that what I was using made sense. So I wanted to compare these to observations. When we look observationally to globular cluster systems and we look at their radial profiles, we normally try to describe them via two functional forms. The first one is a simple power law fit, which I'm showing on the top part of this figure. And what I did was I fitted power law functions to all the radial profiles, and I was trying to fit for the slope. And that's what I'm showing in the top panel of this figure as a function of galaxy stellar mass. The other type of functional form that is typically fit for is what it's called a Cersei profile, or if you fit the slope, it's called a de Vaucouleurs profile. And that's what is shown in the bottom panel of this figure. And in this functional form, because we have already fixed the slope to be a value of 4, the only free parameter is the effective radii, and that's what I'll be showing in the vertical axis as a function again of the galaxy stellar mass. So what I did is that I've took all the simulated galaxies within the 34 megaparsec volume that met a certain criteria that had at least 10 globular clusters, and I fitted these two profiles. And I fitted these profiles for the entire globular cluster population, as well as for the metal poor and the metal rich objects, which are respectively shown as the blue and the red data points. And so what I find is that in our simulated galaxies, globular cluster populations that are hosted in more massive galaxies tend to show shallower and more extended radial profiles. And these are the same trends that we find observationally. What's also quite interesting is that for a given galaxy mass, we find that metal poor globular clusters tend to also be in shallower and more extended radial profiles. And this is the same type of trend that I was discussing for the Milky Way, but that we have been observing in a vast majority, in a large number of extragalactic systems. So this gave us some confidence that the type of galaxies that we're looking at sort of made sense. So we sort of went forward. And so I tried to address the question of whether using the radial profiles of globular clusters, I could trace their origin. And I tried to answer that question using this figure, which is slightly overwhelming. So let me just walk you through it. What we're looking at here are the median radial profiles of globular cluster number density distributions that are shown in the vertical axis as a function of the galactocentric radii normalized by the stellar half-mass radii. And the reason for normalizing is because then we can compare galaxies of different masses. If we go from the left column towards the right one, we're looking at galaxies that are increasingly more massive, and they're divided in 3 galaxy mass bands. Instead, if we move from the top to the bottom, we're looking at the density profiles of globular cluster populations that correspond to the fiducial sample on the top, the metal poor globular clusters in the middle row, and the metal rich objects at the bottom. And last, the orange and the green lines are indicating where these clusters formed. So the orange line are telling us that these globular clusters formed in situ in the central galaxy where they're currently sitting at redshift 0, whereas the green line is tagging all the clusters that formed in a satellite galaxy that got accreted at some point through the evolution of the central galaxy. And so they're called the accreted globular clusters. So if we explore this figure step by step, we can start looking at what the overall globular cluster population does. And what we see here is that as we go towards more massive galaxies, so we start from the left panel and we're moving towards the right, we see that more massive galaxies contain a larger fraction of accreted globular clusters. However, if we focus on the low mass galaxies and we compare the metal poor and the metal rich globular clusters, we see that in low mass galaxies, we do see that they host preferentially metal rich globular clusters that have formed in situ in the central galaxy, whereas the metal poor globular clusters are a combination of objects that have formed in situ and objects that have formed in satellite dwarfs that have been accreted later on. And this is the type of view that we were discussing for the Milky Way. However, as we move towards more massive galaxies, towards the mass regime where the Milky Way is sitting, as well as M31 and more massive systems, we actually see that the accreted globular clusters tend to dominate the outer parts of galaxies that are more massive than 10 to the 10.5. And this is regardless of the globular cluster metallicity. So what this is telling us is that actually we have to be careful when we interpret radial profiles only using the metallicity of the objects. And if we're seeing objects that are towards the outskirts of galaxy, regardless of their metallicity, we can assume that they're accreted and we will be right most of the time. So this was maybe a bittersweet ending for how to answer this question, because it tells us that the story is not as straightforward as we might have hoped, but it was interesting to see how we could use these simulated stellar cluster populations. The second result that I would like to discuss is something that this is extremely recent, and this is ongoing work, but I think it's very fun, and I thought it would be interesting to share it with you. So it all started sort of at the beginning of the summer, because a collaborator and myself, we saw this paper by Mireia Montes and Trujillo from 2019, and Ignacio Trujillo from 2019, in which they used deep observations of galaxy clusters that are in the Hubble deep field. And they realized that the diffuse stellar light in galaxy cluster traces a total mass distribution better than the X-ray does. And this is quite interesting because it's generally assumed that the X-ray emission from hot ionized gas is a good tracer of the overall mass distribution in galaxy clusters. So it was interesting to see how just using the stars and you can actually get a better match. And this is interesting because if we can do this with stars, maybe we can also do this using the spatial distributions of globular clusters. So the project that I've been working on has sort of required me to convert from my theoretical perspective into an observational one. So I've had to put on my observational hat. And what I've done is that I've taken the simulated galaxies and the simulated stellar cluster populations from the 34 megaparsec periodic volume from the eMosaics project. And I'm trying to process them in a way similar to produce similar data output to what observers would get. So what I'm looking at are images like this one. These correspond to the most massive halo in my volume, and all images that I'll show from here onwards will correspond to this halo. So I'll stop referring to it as halo 0. What you're looking at is the central panel corresponds to the dark matter surface density. The left one corresponds to the stellar surface brightness, and the right one corresponds to the globular cluster number surface density. And what we're trying to address is, you see that there's a lot of structure in the dark matter surface density, and you can see the dark matter distribution is actually not perfectly spherical, but it seems to be sort of elongated. So the question is, can we identify structures in the stellar surface brightness map and in the globular cluster number surface density map that resemble the ones that we see, that trace the ones that we see in the dark matter surface density? And this is quite interesting and quite exciting, because we are about to start seeing the results from a large variety of different satellites and observational facilities that are going to be doing deep observations of the universe. And so they're going to be able to produce this sort of data outputs. So if we see that the analysis works both for stars and globulars, we will soon have a lot of observational data to apply this analysis on. So what we need to do is that for each of these images, we need to identify these shapes, these what we call these isodensity contours. And in order to do this, what we do is that for each of these images, we draw a number of radial beams, and in each of these radial beams, we calculate what's the azimuthally average density, which you can see in the middle panel here for the dark matter. And then we get this sort of radial profile. And then we say, well, we want to draw contours at certain given radial distances. And in my case, I'm using 7 of them that go from 1% R200 up to 70% R200. And so what I need to do is I need to go to this radial profile. I interpolate to know what's the density at the radii at which I want to draw the contour. And then I just tell Python to give me the contours that correspond to all the pixels that have the same value as that density. And that is shown on the right side of this slide. As you can see here, these contours are extremely noisy. And if we try and compare different type of contours that are so noisy, we're not gonna get anything clear. So what we need to do first is that we need to smooth our projected images with a Gaussian filter that has a size of 2%. And then we need to identify these isodensity contours at these different radial distances. Now I'm showing the resulting images for stars, dark matter, and globular clusters going from left to right. And the next step is to say that, all right, we have now identified the different structures. And now what we need to do is that for each of the radial distances at which we have identified a structure, we need to decide which is the dominant one. And we need to compare the dominant isodensity structure at each contours across the 3 matter components. For the next figures, you will also see that I've been looking at the total mass distribution, but the results are almost the same as for the dark matter. So I will only be using that one. Mateo, do you have a question? Could you just
I was just curious about why you choose 0.22% as a Gaussian kernel. Is because of the experiment that you're looking at least that has that resolution, or
no? So the gravitational softening in the simulations is 400 parsecs, which is much tinier. 2% is a bit larger than the effective radii of the galaxy, and that sort of makes sense because what we're trying to do is that we're trying to raise the extremely low scale noise while still remaining the signal from galaxies and substructure. So I've repeated the experiment for a variety of different filters. And if your filter is very small, it's too noisy. If your filter is extremely large, you just get a blob. So this is sort of the like choosing a size that is sort of similar to the effective radii of the galaxy sort of gives you the compromise between smoothing enough over your noise while still retaining the signal that you're trying to recover.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. So now what we need to do is that we need to identify this dominant structure at each of the different levels, and we need to compare them. So what I'll do is, or what you can see in this figure is that the background image corresponds to the original dark matter surface density, and the different contours correspond to the dominant structure identified in the different matter components. You can see this image is a bit of a mess, so I'm just going to zoom in to the region of interest. And if we zoom into the central region, we can see that there's a bunch of contours, but I really like this halo because what you can see here is that when we're trying to identify which is the dominant substructure at each of our different contours, we can see that the dark matter and total mass are identifying a very massive subhalo that is sitting sort of towards the right of the image. Whereas if we're just looking at the stars, we're actually seeing this brightest central galaxy in this halo, which is sitting towards the left. Whereas if we use the globular clusters, we're seeing that it's identifying both of these structures as well. We can go galaxy by galaxy and discuss qualitatively how the contours look like for each of them, but it's a bit more useful to use qualitative metrics. And there's actually a metric that comes from image identification, which is called the modified Hausdorff distance. And this tells you what's the largest distance between two contours or two shapes. So in particular, if we're comparing the total mass or dark matter contour, which are the blue and the orange lines, with the globular cluster distribution, it would give us the value that is shown by the arrow. And so what we can do is to say, well, I want to see how far the contours identified in the observed maps, so that is the stars and globulars, are away from the true maps, so the ones that are coming from dark matter and total mass. And so I calculate this modified Hausdorff distance for each of those pairs, and I calculate it at 2 radial distances. So I calculate it at 10% R200 and at 40% R200, because that lets me compare what the inner region of the halo and the outer region of the halo are behaving like. So we can do this for each of our galaxies. And in particular, I'm looking at all galaxies that are more massive than 10 to the 10. And this is what I'm trying to show in this figure. So the vertical axis is showing what's the largest distance between a pair of contours. And I'm normalizing this distance by R200 over the corresponding halo, so I can compare between galaxies. The horizontal axis is showing the galaxy stellar mass. And the left column is showing the results when I'm using the stellar map as my observed map, and I compare that with dark matter and total mass, whereas the right column is showing the equivalent results when I use instead the globular cluster map as my observed map. And then the two rows are whether I'm looking at 10% R200 or 40% R200. What we're seeing overall is that there's a lot of scatter, especially as you go towards lower mass galaxies. But overall, the stellar contours are fairly close to the dark matter contours. They're a bit closer than what the globular cluster contours seem to be. And there's some scatter, but I have to say, and I was quite surprised when I saw this figure, is that the scatter is not that large and the agreement seems to be quite good. So if we do deep observations of stars and of the stellar light in the galactic outskirts and of the spatial distributions of globulars in galaxies, we can trace the shape of the dark matter halo fairly well, like at about 2% R200 precision, which is quite exciting. What I can do, because I work with simulations, is to say, well, if you remember the images that I was showing of Halo 0, there was a lot of substructure there. We might consider that maybe substructure is the cause for this scatter. So I can just repeat the entire analysis, removing all the satellite galaxies from my images. And I can do the same figure, and you can see that the results barely change. So what this is telling you is that despite there is substructure in these images, the stellar and the globular cluster contours still seem to be tracing the dark matter distribution fairly well. And this is exciting because in observations, we cannot remove substructure from our images. So it's telling us that we might be able to apply this analysis to observe galaxies. So just briefly, what we can also do with these spatial distributions is to quantify the morphology a bit more. And in particular, we can use the projected particle distributions, which I'm showing here for dark matter, stars, and globular clusters. And we can try and quantify what is the reduced mass moment of inertia tensor. And we can calculate what are the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of this tensor when looking at different apertures in this distribution. Because these eigenvalues and these eigenvectors are telling us what are the semi-major length and vectors describing the ellipses that encompass the particle distribution at two different sizes. So I've done this analysis again at 10% and 40% of R200 just to see if there's a difference between the inner and the outer part of the dark matter halo. And using these eigenvalues and eigenvectors, we can look at what's the ellipticity of each of these distributions, but also at what's the misalignment angles between two distributions. So if I look at my globular cluster distribution and I see that the semi-major axis vector is pointing in this direction, is dark matter going to be aligned or is it going to be offset, and by how much? So we can look at all of these quantities for our galaxies, and these are just some very preliminary results. So when we look at the ellipticity, we see that as expected, dark matter halos are more circular than they are flattened. And what we see for stars is that they seem to be distributions that are more flattened of the three of them. What's interesting is that globular clusters seem to be sort of sitting in between. So they're not as circular, not as flattened, just weirdos in between. What's also quite interesting is that there doesn't seem to be much of a difference whether we're looking at the inner part of the halo or the outer part of the halo. The other quantity that we can look at is this misalignment angle. So if I look at the globular cluster dark matter pair, globular cluster stars, or stars and dark matter, in each of these three cases, we seem to be seeing that overall these distributions are aligned, although there seem to be some tail towards small offsets. These are just a very preliminary results, because the way I'm seeing the project so far is that it has at least a couple of caveats that I have identified, and maybe you can tell me more, which would be very exciting. So the first caveat that this analysis has up until now is that in order to derive some of the observational properties, you need to assume a distance. So far, I've been assuming a distance of 10 megaparsecs because the vertical cluster is about 16 megaparsecs away, but there are many galaxy clusters, big galaxy clusters, for which we have studies of globular cluster populations that are sitting at 100 nanoparsecs or even 200 nanoparsecs and more away. So I need to see really where distance plays a role at modifying my observational quantities and what is the best estimate for this. And the second caveat that this analysis has, and it's something that I'm thinking about at the moment, is how exactly do we choose our globular clusters? Because when we're doing the stellar surface brightness maps, the way of selecting what I'm seeing from this galaxy is just saying, well, if I'm gonna be predicting what LSST is going to see, I can use the surface brightness limit from this particular telescope. However, for globular clusters, we want to be selecting them on an observational basis. I'm trying to mimic observational selection functions, while at the same time avoiding the fact that in the eMosaic simulations, we are under disrupting the population of low mass, metal rich, and young clusters. And so I need to, I'm trying to come up with a good observational selection function that helps me prevent this. And just as an example, in this figure, I'm showing the number of globular clusters per radial beam, so the spatial distribution as a function of projected radii for 4 different ways of selecting globulars. And you can see that the orange line, which is what I've been showing so far, has this huge peak in the center, and this is what I don't want. So I'm trying to come up with a good alternative. So just summarizing, I've discussed different strategies of how we can model the formation and evolution of stellar clusters down from the very small scales to galaxy sizes and the cosmic environment. I've discussed how we can use the radial profiles of globular cluster populations to encode information about their origin. And I've shown that the projected number density of globulars follows the inner shape of the dark matter halo down to galaxies of masses of 10 to the 10 solar masses, which is exciting because that's lower mass than our own galaxy. So we might be able to apply this to a large number of galaxies. Thank you for your attention. And I'd be happy to take any other questions.
Thanks. Yeah, so are there any questions? You can just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Okay. So Robert has a question. How do the mass functions of globular clusters in different galaxies compare?
So if you look at the massive clusters, for the results of the eMosaics project, what we've seen so far is that if you look at the massive clusters, they do what we would expect, and they do what observations tell us that the real universe do. However, as you go from masses of 10 to the 5 or even 5 times 10 to the 4 downwards, we have too many objects, and this is not what we observe. So the observational globular cluster mass function is a log normal shape with a peak at more or less 10 to the 5 solar masses. And we don't end up having the complete downturn at low masses in the eMosaics project. And this is something that we've been trying to address in the Emp Pathfinder simulations, and there we indeed have the log normal shape. So in eMosaics, it's not great, but in Pathfinder, it's better. So we're sort of slowly trying to come up with a good answer.
Daryl, you can ask your question.
Hi there. Thanks for the awesome talk. I came in a little late, so forgive me, please, if I missed some part of this. And I'm asking a question that you answered already. I apologize. But I wonder whether or not you have ever taken one of your sort of more detailed, you said you simulated many Milky Way mass galaxies. And I'm wondering whether or not you've ever compared those directly to observations from something that's a dynamical measurement like Gaia. I mean, I know you have all these amazing data sets that you are comparing to, but I'm wondering whether or not you've made that attempt at sort of a one-to-one comparison.
So we know that none of our Milky Ways is really the Milky Way, in the sense that the way these galaxies were selected was that we just look for halos that had the same mass, more or less the same mass of the Milky Way in one of the parent Eagle volumes, and we just sort of re-simulated them. So we didn't place any constraints on stellar mass or morphology or star formation rates or any of those things. There's one galaxy that is quite close. What we do have done, this was a paper that was led by Megan Hughes. She was a PhD student at Liverpool. She used the globular cluster populations in the Milky Way mass sample to say, well, if you use dynamical mass tracer models, I think that's the name, what do you expect? And like, how many clusters do you need? And what, for example, what uncertainties in the velocities can you allow yourself have if you want to have a good measurement of the mass estimate or the shape of the dark matter halo? So we looked into that, but more as a reference towards future studies that try to use this technique on other galaxies rather than saying these are the exact comparison with our own galaxy, because we know that we don't fully recover a Milky Way.
Great, thank you so much.
No worries, thanks for the question.
I think Robert had a follow-up question I didn't see until after Joel started. Whether the peak is universal across galaxies.
If you mean
the peak of the mass function.
I imagine. Observationally?
Observationally, yeah.
Yes. So, and this is something that's fairly intriguing because what's near universal is the peak of the globular cluster luminosity function. And if we assume a constant mass to light ratio, which is almost constant for these type of objects, it transforms into a near universal peak for the globular cluster mass function. And this is something that has been in the literature for a while. It has been observed for a while, and there hasn't been a good explanation for it. But what I'm seeing from Emp Pathfinder, so from my own set of simulations, is that we can start with the initial population of stellar clusters can have a mass distribution that is a power law, and that can very quickly transform into a log normal shape just because of how disruption of this object happens. And I've been running 21 galaxies. They all show the same shape. They all have the same peak of the globular cluster mass function. So these are only Milky Ways. But if we were to run like different galaxy masses, I would expect that they would show a similar trend. So I don't have this figure in this particular talk, but I could we could discuss more later if you want.
Do you have any other questions?
Yes, I have another question. So about the simulations, so they contain dark matter, and then on the baryonic side, what exactly are you tracing stars, or are you just tracing hydrodynamical matter?
Both. So we have dark matter. We have what we call gas, which are basically hydrodynamical elements or elements for which we solve the equations of Hydra. And then we also have stellar particles. But the issue with the type of simulations the kind of the last bit of the simulation that I was describing is that the typical mass resolutions in galaxy formation simulations are of the order of 10 to the 5 solar masses. So what we're saying is that one star in our simulations is actually a blob of mass that represents a stellar population, or 10 to the 5 solar masses worth of stars. And so the trick that we're doing in eMosaics and Pathfinder is to say that within this 10 to the 5, part of that mass is in stellar clusters.
Okay, so follow-up, is the transfer of mass from gas to stars included?
There's transfer from stars to gas because stars have stellar evolution. And so when, so for example, when a star is evolved, or when the stellar population within one of these blobs of stellar mass sort of evolves and it has AGB winds, we output the corresponding amount of mass back into the gas. And when they do supernovae, we also output some energy and some momentum and some mass back into the medium.
Thanks. I also put a comment in the chat just for you.
Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions before we wrap up? Okay, if there are no questions, thank you again, Marta, for like the great talk. I invite everyone to show your appreciation in the comments and in yeah, so I think we can end it here, and then you have your meeting with the grad students with this same link in about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Marta. It was a beautiful talk.
Thank you.